So before we begin exploring design for good and looking at the case studies, I think it's important to share my personal story, as my journey has influenced not only the trajectory of my career and life, but also the service-centered volunteering that I have come to do over the years. I am a Mexican and Puerto Rican American, and I was the first in my family to graduate high school and graduate college. I grew up in poverty to a single mother on the west side of Chicago in a neighborhood called Humboldt Park. I witnessed abuse. People that I loved deeply were impacted by drug addiction and gang violence, and I saw things that people would think most kids should never see. But that's just the reality for most inner city kids. I went to Chicago public schools until I was about 12, and the schools in our communities were and still are some of the most segregated schools in the nation, with majority Black and Latino students. And even today, they're still underfunded and undersupported. Education is an incredibly important part of my journey and purpose. My experience in the CPS taught me early on that inequity is something very commonplace in poor communities, but many who come from places of privilege don't understand that. When I became a professor, I knew I wanted to inspire other people who came from backgrounds like my own to follow their dreams. But I also know the difficulties we face when it comes to overcoming the hurdles of life. So I've made it my purpose to help as many people with upbringing similar to my own as I can in my career as an educator. I also made it a point to educate myself on the history behind the racism that is deeply rooted in this country. I have experienced racism as a Latina, but I make it a point to not center myself, as I know far too many in the Black communities who have experienced unspeakable things. I've made it a point to educate myself and be a role model for my own children, to learn and support organizations like Black Lives Matter so that we may be an ally for communities of all color, not just our own. My mother didn't graduate high school because she was pregnant with me at age 17. She moved us to the suburbs when I was around 12, but our problems still followed. And trauma is a connecting thread throughout my story and many of the stories of troubled youth that we see and hear about in the news. And that trauma led me down a path of depression and anxiety as a teenager and to a mental health crisis when I was 19. Thankfully, I was able to connect with a youth organization that helped me work on healing and taught me healthy coping skills. That very organization is one that I dedicated quite a few of my years to in my adult life as both a volunteer and a youth mentor, and as a professional working on their prevention team. I speak on my journey with mental health from time to time over on YouTube, and even as an adult, it's something that I still have to work on, and that is why I found it fulfilling and important to support organizations that work with at-risk youth and that focus on things like mental health and therapy. Despite the hardships that we face, my mother wanted to do everything in her power to do better for my younger brother and I. That move to the suburbs was the first step. She believed that me going to college and graduating high school would help break the cycle of trauma and poverty that our family experienced. And this is actually where my journey leading to working with the Debt Collective began. The Debt Collective is a social justice focused debtors union using its collective power to fight for anti-racist economic policies, better conditions in our financial lives for a more equitable society through things like fighting to cancel student loans and access to publicly funded goods like education, healthcare, housing, and more. So how did I get there? My mother didn't know much about higher ed. She didn't know that it would be cheaper to attend a community college, but as a professional working in higher ed, even community college costs have risen exponentially and are becoming out of reach for many. My mother didn't have savings for college for me, and I think it's important to elaborate that this isn't for lack of trying. This is because we lived paycheck to paycheck as she worked as a housekeeper. I even started working at 14 to help her to ensure that our lights and our heat wouldn't be turned off and that we wouldn't get evicted. We had no generational wealth. There was no amount of bootstrapping or saving we could have done to allow me to have saved for or afford college. At 17, I had to leave home to live on my own, and at 18, I took in my younger brother for a couple of years due to the domestic violence that my mom was suffering at the hands of her then boyfriend. And despite all of this, I managed to graduate high school early. Yet I had to navigate the process of pursuing higher ed on my own on top of working and taking care of myself and my brother, and had to take out student loans to cover the cost of tuition. I was also recruited by a for-profit college, a school that recruited me with some very unethical sales practices, and they sold me lies about job placement after graduation, salary potential, and they essentially offered me a cut-rate education that cost me $100,000. And then I graduated into the 2008 recession. I pursued grad school in hopes that it would offer me better opportunities, and despite graduating the top of my MBA class in 2011 and all the hard work that I put in as a woman and a Latinx millennial, my income has not kept up with inflation. I also faced gender wage gaps, and I worked in corporate for many years, and then I pursued academia. But the reality is that most universities and colleges today don't put people on tenure track anymore. They would rather hire adjuncts at low rates, and so that they don't have to give them benefits. So here I am, often overqualified and underpaid as an adjunct professor, but I make it work. I love what I do, but I won't lie, the career is a struggle due to the very low pay, and personally I don't think it's just for employees to have to make sacrifices for the opportunity to do what we love. Equitable wages are important, and much too often places put profit over people. But like I said, I do what I can and I work hard to make it work. I'm over $170,000 in student debt with no relief in sight as of now. And I work 3 jobs. I teach in higher ed, I freelance, and I teach online through platforms just like Skillshare. And I'm also a mother to an 8-year-old and a 13-year-old daughter. And I'm fighting for their future and for others like me. And maybe for you if you are in student debt. My story isn't unique though. I'm one of the many in the working class, poor, and BIPOC communities who worked to claw their way out of poverty and were instead left with insurmountable debt. We are often told we didn't do enough, yet we never had enough to start with. Instead of allowing myself to become a victim of my circumstance, I work to make a difference, to channel my anger, my emotion, my feelings, and my experiences into organizing. Through activism, through my art and design, and volunteering with organizations like the Debt Collective or the youth services organizations that I have in the past, or supporting things like Black Lives Matter and the Unity Rally that I was a part of last summer. Through all of these things, I've been able to make a small difference. And when it comes to the Debt Collective, I'm part of a group of student strikers, and I believe that education is a right, and we're fighting for very big changes. I shouldn't have had to mortgage out my life to better it. So I channel my experience into the time I give as a volunteer and as a community leader. And my hope is that I will leave this world a little bit better than I found it.